Shalom and welcome to the second lesson in our new four-part series, Hosea, a love that would not let me go. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for notifications of when all our new videos are posted. And while you're over there, check out some of the other videos that are available. I have over 100 of them. If you'd like to join us for our live study, you can actually contact me through Facebook Messenger, and I'll send you a link and a password for our free Zoom classes. They're held every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So before we get started, I really do want to apologize for those studying with us who don't have a book. At the end of Lesson 1's video, I said that we would be unpacking chapters 4 through 10, and I really misspoke, and I'm so sorry. We're actually only going to be unpacking chapters 4 through 6 in this lesson and chapters 7 through 10 in lesson 3. So if you were prepared to go through chapter 10, you already have a head start for next week. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just do kind of a quick review of chapters 1 through 3. So who are these chapters directed to? Well, they're actually directed straight to Hosea. They're not directed to Israel at all. And in chapters 1 through 3, God spoke to Hosea either 5 or 6 different times, but it always pertained to the exact same message. And it was kind of a two-part message. The first one was, go and take a wife that you know good and well is going to commit adultery. Now that's a tall enough order. But then the second part is, go have kids of adultery. In other words, go claim these children that she's absolutely going to have through her adultery and go claim them as your own. Make them fully able to inherit everything, raise them as your own. You're going to name them and you're going to treat them as if they are your children, even though they belong to, probably all 3 of them belong to 3 different men. Now the first one that Hosea named was called Jezreel, which means God will sow. But what it meant in the days of Israel is that God was going to sow curses, but then eventually God was going to sow future blessings. Then he had his little girl, and his little girl he named Lodwama. Now Lodwama means no compassion, because God was not going to have any more compassion on Israel. And then he had a son named Lo-Ami, which means not my people. And God further reiterated that by saying, and I'm not their God either. Now Hosea was told he needed to love his wife again. And he needed to go and he needed to buy her back. Her restoration was going to be based solely on Hosea's love for her. And Israel's restoration, and even our restoration, is based on God's love for us. We were bought back with a really hefty price of death. For all believers, we have a future hope if we seek God earnestly. Now, these first 3 chapters were prophesied in the northern kingdom while Jeroboam II and Uzziah were actually the kings of Judah, or of the southern kingdom. So let's get into kind of the historical and cultural context of the chapters we're going to be looking at tonight, chapters 4 through 6. These chapters are actually going to be directed to now the people of Israel, and more specifically to the priests in Israel. And the message is also twofold. One, they have absolutely no knowledge of God whatsoever. And number 2, because of their lack of knowledge, they're going to be destroyed. Now, this message was probably given sometime between the first and second times that Assyria actually went into Israel and took captives out. So somewhere between 732 and 722 BC. Now, at this time of chapters 4 through 6, Jotham and or Ahaz were actually going to be the rulers of the southern kingdom, which was Judah. Now, these chapters really seem to focus on one area of Israel, Ephraim. Now, Ephraim, if you remember way back in the book of Exodus, was one of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And they were adopted by Jacob, and they became one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And at this point in history, they're probably one of only a very few tribes that were actually left in Israel that Assyria had not already taken over. Now, these chapters follow the exact same prophetic pattern as the first message. God's going to deal with Israel's sin, then he's going to deal with the consequences of their sin, and then God's going to give them a promise of return and of a future hope. So let's dig in. If you'll turn in your Bibles to Hosea chapter 4, we're going to look at the first 6 verses first. The very first word in chapter 4 is Shema. Listen. Listen with an intent to obey. Why? Why do I need to listen? Because really, your obedience is a direct interpretation of how well you listened. For example, my husband many years ago asked me to go, while I was going grocery shopping, asked me to get him deodorant. And I asked him which one, and I thought he said the green. So I go to the grocery store and I'm looking through the whole deodorant section and I'm popping open lids and I'm finding all the ones that are green. I didn't know if he meant a green label. I didn't know if he meant the green like the deodorant was green. I wasn't real sure. So I kind of got the ones that I thought were green and I started smelling all of them until I found one that I thought kind of smelled like him. So I bought it and I brought it home and I said, I got you your deodorant. I got you the green deodorant, the only one that kind of smelled like you. And lo and behold, of all the deodorants that God ever led man to invent, that was the one that my husband absolutely hated. He would rather smell like disgusting, dirty armpits than use this deodorant. But my obedience of going and getting him the green deodorant was an exact representation of my interpretation of what I had thought I heard, because in fact, he asked me to get the deodorant degree, not the green. So listening is where our knowledge and our understanding come from. And then our obedience is our interpretation of what we heard. So I didn't do so well with the whole deodorant, and Israel in chapter 4 of Hosea isn't doing so well either. As a matter of fact, God says he has a case, a ra'ib, a dispute against them. And he lists 9 things that he has absolutely done with them about. 1, he says, you have no faithfulness. You are faithless. There's no kindness. There's no knowledge of God in that land. They are swearing. They're full of deception, murder, stealing, adultery, and violence. Now I want you to take a step back and think just a minute. Does any of this really sound familiar if we just kind of look out our own windows? Do you think that the issues we're having today can really be attributed to the lack of knowledge of God in our own land? I mean, think about God's laws, the 10 Commandments found in Exodus chapter 20. Which of these laws had Israel broken? They'd broken every single one of them. And as a result, the land is going to mourn. And everyone is languished. Look at the laws, local laws, federal laws that we now have in our land that fly in the face of God's commandments. And look how many of the 10 commandments have now been legislated against. And I'm telling you right now, our land is mourning. And our people are languished. In Israel, it said that the people were weak and they were wasting away, and the animals and the birds and the fish and everything in nature and creation was being affected by it. Because sin rarely, if ever, does sin only affect the sinner. And look who God singles out as rejecting knowledge. He didn't start with the lay people. He didn't start with the people that said, hey, I realized that there's been no proper worship of God, no mention of me in this land for almost 200 years. He goes straight to the priests. And he said, you're the reason that these people are lacking knowledge of God is because you've rejected God. And because they rejected God, God rejected them as priests. They had absolutely ignored his law. And so God said, I'm going to ignore your children, your flock, the people. Now, God had specific intentions and standards for the priesthood. First of all, every 7 years during Sukkot, the priests were to read the law to the people so the people would hear it and they would learn to fear God. They're to give true and correct instruction to preserve knowledge. They needed to act like they were messengers of God because, in fact, that's exactly what they were. I mean, in God's plan for all of Israel, and by extension, all of believers, was to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But not even the priests lived according to God's laws. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of weird, but the priests literally fed on the people's sins. They were actually allowed to eat a portion of the sacrifices the people brought to the temple. That way, they didn't have to worry about taking care of flocks and taking care of crops for themselves, and therefore take away their service to the temple. But the priests of Hosea's time were absolutely abusing that provision. They were eating things that had been sacrificed to idols. It was so bad in Israel, you couldn't tell a priest from a layman. And I'm telling you, in some congregations today, you still can't tell the difference. So God tells them, you know what? You're going to eat and eat and eat and eat, but it will absolutely never be enough. Now, Jeremiah and 1 Peter both warn us about what happens when the priesthood becomes corrupted. In Jeremiah 5:30 and 31, God says an appalling and horrible thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule in their own authority. And my people love it. They love it that way. But what are they going to do when the end comes? And 1 Peter 3 says, therefore, rid yourselves of all malice, all deceit and hypocrisy and envy, all slander, and like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord and coming to him as to a living stone which has been rejected by the people, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Christ Jesus. Are you, as a living stone, being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood? Or are you caught in malice and deceit and hypocrisy and evil and slander, being built up to a spiritual house of corruption and harlotry? Now, in verses 11 through 14, God says that what spiritual harlotry actually does is it takes away understanding. And that word for understanding is actually lev. It's the heart. It's the inner man. It's your knowledge and your thinking and your reflection and your memory and your moral character. And the scripture tells us people without any heart, without understanding, they're going to be completely ruined. It says the spirit of harlotry actually led them away because they exchanged God for wooden idols. And the daughters were actually playing the harlot, and so were the wives playing harlot. But God said, I'm not going to hold them accountable. And you want to know why? Because it was you men who actually went after the harlots and the temple prostitutes. Your daughters and your wives were simply following your bad example that you were setting. So I'm not holding them accountable. I'm holding you accountable. Verses 15 starts with a warning. And the warning isn't to Israel. The warning is actually to Judah. And he's telling Judah, don't be like Israel, Gilgal and Bet Aven. Now, Gilgal and Bet Aven, those were actually centers of spiritual harlotry. Now, Bet Aven means the house of iniquity, the house of sin. And it actually may have been an intentional name change of Beth-El, which means the house of God. Or some people think that it was actually a separate place. But either way, it was definitely a place of idol worship. And God's telling Judah, don't be like them. Learn from what's happening to Israel and don't be like them. Now let's move on to chapter 5. Now chapter 4 began with the word Shema, listen. This chapter begins with the word heed, pay attention, listen. I'm about to tell you something you really need to know. Pay attention. Because what he's saying is, you priests and you royals, you people of Israel, you need to hear what God's going to tell you. Because the leaders and the priests and the king's house, you especially need to pay attention to this prophecy, because it was their lack of knowledge and corrupt leadership that snared the people. And they were going to face judgment because of it. He said these revolters, these people who are swerving, were deep in their depravity, so deep they weren't even able to go back to God. They were enslaved to and overpowered by their sin. But in verse 15, God says there's hope. He says, I will go away. I'm going away. And I will return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, because in their distress, they'll search for me. So God was leaving, but he wasn't going to stay gone. The people just needed to acknowledge their guilt and seek him. But unfortunately, the one thing that was going to cause them to go back to God is the same thing that causes so many of us to go back to God, and that's our affliction. In John 8:34 and 35, Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. Now, the slave doesn't remain in the house forever, but the son does remain forever. So if the son sets you free, you really will be free. Guys, we have a choice. You can be a nose ring wearing slave to sin, or an earring wearing doulos, a love slave, a servant by choice to righteousness. And what dictates that choice is who we choose to worship. Are you humbling yourself before God, or are you stuck in a cycle of pride and arrogance and deceit, which is the idol worship of yourself and absolutely flies in the face of the first commandment? Now, verse 8 mentions a few places, Gibeah, Ramah, and Bet Aven again. Now, these were places very near on the border, very near to Judah. And they were situated on some high hills, on places for watchmen to sit and to look out and to warn the people of impending danger. And verse 8 says they're to blow a trumpet. They have to warn these border cities, because these border cities were the very last line of defense before the enemy would come on into Judah. Now look at the contrast Hosea prophesies about Ephraim. Instead of going to God for healing, they chose to run to the other nations instead. That's spiritual harlotry. So instead of being healed by God, God was just going to rip them to pieces. So let's move on to the last chapter we're going to look at tonight, and that's Hosea chapter 6. Now I want to look at the first 3 verses, because when you first read those, they seem totally out of context, but then it seems like, wow, they've had this great spiritual revival, and that was kind of quick, and what exactly happened? But I have to tell you, when I first read those, I honestly thought that these were like declarations by the false prophets, just like in the days of Jeremiah, when people were saying, peace, peace, but there really wasn't any peace. Especially when I read the contrast that starts down in verse 4. But after I studied some more and after I prayed about it, I truly believe that chapter 6, 1 through 3 demonstrates what chapter 5, verse 15 would look like when they acknowledge their guilt, when they seek God, and when God returns to them. This is what it would look like. But Israel never acknowledged their sin, never acknowledged their guilt, never sought after God. And so we're going to see, starting in verse 4, what they were really like. Now, according to Lamentations 3:40 and Joel chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, we need to examine our ways. What are we doing before we can actually go back to God with our whole heart? Because if we're not going to examine our ways and we just kind of look over our shoulder and say, yeah, God, I'm sorry for what I'm doing, but we're still going through our sin and we're still on our sin path, that's not repentance. That's not looking to return to God with our whole heart. We have to examine what we're doing. And when we do, God is going to be gracious and compassionate and slow to anger, abounding in chesed and mercy, and relenting of evil. Now in verse 4, God actually starts with a very rhetorical question for both Ephraim, which is representing the northern kingdom of Israel, but also Judah. He says, what am I going to do with you? You know, that's typically what I tell our kids, when they're doing something just really bizarre and off the wall. What am I going to do with you? And God's asking them the question because look at their sins that he's going to contend with. Because he lists something new. Now he says, you have no loyalty to God. You are faithless. Your faithfulness to God is gone. God desires loyalty above sacrifice. But Hosea says Israel's loyalty to God just disappeared like the dew of the morning. And if you look, who had God sent to warn the people that they'd broken his covenant? Who does God always send? His prophets. But way back in chapter 4, we're told that just like the priesthood was corrupted, the prophets were corrupted. The ones who should have been a light to Israel were actually darkness themselves. And then God goes on to compare the priests to raiders and murderers. Because if you look, where are they going while they're murdering? They're going to Shechem. Shechem is what we say in English, Shechem. Shechem. It's a religious center. So they were on their way to perform their priestly religious duties, but on the way, they're continuing to commit harlotry against God and in essence, dooming the people who are walking there following their example, looking up to them. You know, Matthew 28, 19 and 20, the Great Commission says, go. And that literally means in your going, make disciples. So as you go, you are to make disciples, because as you go, you are not to be murderers. You are not to be condemning people by your example. By your example as you go, you should be making disciples. I mean, judgment was coming. Israel wasn't going to be able to avoid it, but God did give a world of hope to Judah. And if you think about it, it's very interesting. What's the one thing Judah had that Israel didn't, besides covenant? Judah knew exactly how long their captivity was going to last. They knew that when they went into captivity, it was only going to be for 70 years. And when it was over, they were going to be able to come back home. God even named the king that would pay them to go back home 150 years before that king was ever born. Israel never had that assurance. Now, before we end today's lesson, I'm going to leave you with 3 application questions. And my sincere hope is that you take the time to pray over these questions and ask God to bring any dark places in your life to the light, so they can be recognized, rectified, and repented. The first question, is there pride in your life that actually testifies against you? And are there areas where you're vulnerable? Are you vulnerable to pride in your ministry, in your home, At work? Where are you vulnerable to have this idol worship of yourself above God? Number 2, is loyalty, chesed, is faithfulness, actually part of your everyday walk? Are you really diligent and very careful about all these externals, these religious rituals, but you're actually missing the inner quality of truly knowing the living God? And number 3, as you go to your Shem, how do you behave? How do you conduct your life to and from all of your kind of religious activities? And are there any inconsistencies between what you say and how you behave? Which is, in fact, your halakha. That's your walk through life. And I've said it before, and you've probably heard me say it 100 times. If your walk doesn't match your talk, then one of them is absolutely a lie. So, lot to pray about, lot to think about. In Hosea, a love that would not let me go. So I want to thank you for joining me for our second lesson. And if you're studying with us and you don't have a book, you can prepare for the next lesson, for lesson 3, by studying Hosea chapters 7 through 10. And if you've already studied those chapters in anticipation for tonight's lesson, no problem. Just go back and read over them to kind of refamiliarize yourself. So until next time, everyone, Shavua Tov, have a great, great week. Shalom, shalom.